Hi, I'm Ethan Werner, and I'm just had a couple questions about the Battle of Stalingrad. And you are?
I'm Scott Warner, your father.
So I just had a couple of questions. So why did he send his troops? Why did Hitler send his troops to Russia if they were strong allies? Was it because for his greed of wanting to rule the world constantly?
Actually, the Russians, the Soviets, and the Germans at the time were allies, and this was right after um, um, the Germans were struggling with Britain, and Hitler was looking for what he called the Lebensraum, which was living space for the German people. But most importantly, what he really wanted was oil. He needed oil to keep his war machine going. And there was lots of oil in the oil-rich Caucasus, which was southeast of Stalingrad. So when Hitler decided to invade the Soviet Union, it was very much a need for resources to keep his army fed and to keep his army machine rolling forward.
So do you think the reason maybe why he didn't have so much oil was because his ally Japan was also struggling to find oil, so they couldn't provide for each other?
That was the biggest problem Germany had. Germany as a country is locked in the middle of Europe. It doesn't have easy access to the open oceans, which is why they didn't have a strong navy, and they didn't have a lot of natural resources in the country itself. So a lot of what Hitler wanted to do to invade other countries was about getting natural resources and living space for his German people. But it also had to do with his belief that Germans were a superior race to every other race on the planet, including the Russians, which he thought the Soviets were what he called Untermensch, or people that were lower status than Germans.
So how did Hitler manage to make it all the way to Moscow and still lose? Was it his military, his troop number, his morale, the weather, the unfamiliar territory? Do you think maybe like some of the propaganda, like I showed you before, maybe could have moraled more people to help him in the war?
It actually was a combination of everything that you said. The Battle of Stalingrad actually started in July. The invasion of the Soviet Union was actually started late. It was supposed to start in the early spring of 1942. It ended up getting delayed, which proved to be disastrous because it takes time. If you think about it, Russia is the largest country in the entire world, and Stalingrad is 700 miles from the Russian border, if not more. So when Germany invaded, they used all of their knowledge that they gained from invading France, which was blitzkrieg. They had a mechanized war, they had mechanized troops, and they could move at lightning speed. And quite frankly, because of the Warsaw Pact, Stalin didn't think that Germany was ever going to invade. It came as a complete and utter surprise. So in the early stages of the battle, when Germany started to invade the Soviet Union, the Soviets quickly retreated as far as they could east to get away from the Germans. But in the meantime, hundreds of thousands of Russian troops were encircled, captured, and killed along the way.
So how can Germans have such an effective way of getting through countries using blitzkrieg, get through all of France and make it all the way to Moscow and still not be able to finish the job? Was it that they had allies and help? Was it that Russia had stronger military and was able to push back? Was there just a really outlying factor?
It had to do with the same thing that stopped Napoleon in the wars of the early 1800s. It was the dreaded Russian winter. And like I said, the invasion of the Soviet Union started later than they would have liked. And it wasn't until September that the German army had backed the Soviets all the way up to the Volga River. So Stalingrad sits on the Volga River. and they had backed up the Soviet military all the way to a 9-mile strip along the river that was only about 2 miles wide. And by October, it was almost completely gone. They had pushed the Soviets back to within less than a mile of the Volga River, and they were only able to supply troops, the Soviets, via barges crossing the river under heavy German machine gun fire. The problem is that it was October, and the Russian winter was starting to set in, and the German troops, their supply lines had become incredibly stretched, and General Paulus's 6th Army was at the spearhead of trying to drive the Soviets out of Stalingrad. The other interesting thing about the battle was Stalin himself said he would not allow the Soviet troops to retreat. More importantly, he wouldn't let the 400,000 civilians that were living in the city leave either, because he thought that if there was civilians in the city, Russian troops would fight harder to defend the city, which of course also Stalingrad was Stalin's own name, a city named after him. So it was of significant importance politically for him. On the German side, it was very politically important for Hitler to be able to defeat the city, take the city that was named after the leader of the Soviet Union. But most importantly, it was an industrial city that was a big producer of armaments for the Soviet military. So the Germans thought if they could take it, they could stop production of armaments, and it was on the way to the southern oil-rich Caucasus, which was really, really important. But what happened is that by the time October rolled around, when the 6th Army under General Paulus was finally poised to take the city, they had run out of ammunition. The Germans had run out of supplies, and their morale became incredibly low. 50 miles behind, west of the city, the German front was only held by Hungarian, Romanian, and Italian troops that were nowhere near the same level of skill and strength as Germans. So under General Zhukov from the Soviet Union, they launched Operation Saturn, which was about encirclement. So during the early stages of the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Germans mastered something called encirclement, where they would have an army come from around the flanks on one side as well as on the other on a pincer movement. And they would encircle troops and capture a huge number of troops. And that's how they would work their way into the Soviet Union. Essentially, the Soviets did the same trick back to the Germans. They went across the Volga River, way outside of the city, came around 50 miles behind the main German front lines, attacked much weaker Hungarian, Romanian, and Italian troops, and encircled 250,000 German troops, the 6th Army that was now captured, basically, inside Stalingrad. And from October until February, when General Paulus finally surrendered, the city was absolutely pounded. It was pounded by the air from the Luftwaffe with bombs. The Soviets pounded it themselves to try to kick out German troops, and the city was absolutely under siege. You ended up with 40,000 civilians that died, along with over 800,000 German troops during the battle. But what was terrible is during the winter, there was no food, there wasn't winter clothing, there was disease and horrible, horrible conditions for Soviet troops, German troops, and the civilian population. It was actually the turning point of World War II. It was the most epic battle of the war and the absolute turning point, because after Germany lost the Battle of Stalingrad, that's when they started their long retreat back to Germany, And shortly thereafter is when the Americans landed on D-Day and started to squeeze Germany from both sides, from the west and the east.
So, why would Hitler send all of his troops to a country in which is his ally, and after just coming off of a loss in a battle in Britain? Now, would this just be because he wants more country, he wants to seize more land, more territory, he wants to feel empowered? Why would he go after one of his stronger allies?
He basically signed the Warsaw Pact, which created the Soviet Union as an ally, only because he wanted to protect his eastern flank. When he launched his war, he knew he was going to try to invade Belgium, France, and take all of Europe. And he knew he was going to launch Operation Sea Lion, which was the battle to take Britain. He always wanted to just protect his eastern flank. After he lost the Battle of Britain, which in his mind he didn't really think he lost it, he just postponed it basically, because the Battle of Britain was an air battle which he lost after the United Kingdom fought back so fiercely and kept the Germans out of the sky. But what he really needed was three things, as he said. Number one was Lebensraum. Again, it was all about needing more living space for the German people. Number two, what we hear about a lot in the news today with Ukraine, which was part of the Soviet Union in the 1940s. It's the breadbasket of the world. They grow more grains and wheat and food. And he knew he needed food to feed his armies. He wasn't getting enough food out of Western Europe. And third, and very importantly, in the World War II, it was all about oil and mechanized warfare. And he needed oil to keep his machines, his tanks, his planes, his ships going. And there was no oil in Europe. All the oil is in the southern Caucasus, which is southeast of Stalingrad. So actually, there was Army Group B, which was taking Stalingrad. Army Group A was sent south to the Caucasus to try to get oil, and actually ordered to turn around when the battle wasn't going so well in Stalingrad. But it was a colossal error on Hitler's part. It was ego, and he personally became very involved in the battles, both of Stalingrad and to take Moscow. And largely, the reason why they were unsuccessful is because Hitler himself got so involved in the tactics and didn't know what he was doing.
So overall, how do you think the Germans felt after losing? Was it a smart decision to invade their allies, or did it just cause their demise?
It was done. That was, as I said, the turning point of the war, because their supply lines had become so incredibly stretched. They actually tried to keep Paulus's Sixth Army going through airdrops and dropping supplies in via airplane, and they just couldn't. They didn't have enough airplanes and enough supplies to keep troops going during the winter. They not enough ammunition, not enough winter clothing. There was so many issues. By the time Paulus surrendered in February, when the winter had absolutely crushed them, there was 250,000 troops that were taken off the battlefield, and the remaining troops just retreated as fast as they could back. By that time, also, the Soviet Union started to launch their T-34 tanks, which were vastly superior. There was one thing that the Germans didn't count on, was the Russians, after Stalingrad was invaded, and as well as Moscow, they literally moved all of their industrial manufacturing east to protect it, so that it wouldn't fall into German hands or be destroyed. And as those battles were lost by the Germans, the Soviet Union started to crank out hundreds of thousands of T-34 tanks, which were far superior to the tanks that were out on the battlefield before that point.
Alrighty. Thank you for the interview, and thank you for telling me a little bit more about the Battle of Stalingrad.
Yeah, epic battle.
Thanks everyone for watching. I really enjoyed learning a lot more about the Battle of Stalingrad, and I hope I can do more things like this in next year's class.